So today I'd like to talk to you about vegetative propagation. And personally, I think vegetative propagation is a wonderful topic. It's something that everybody can apply at home, something one can do pretty much cost-free. It's very easy to do. One can do anything through from the simplest through to the most complicated types of propagation. And it's something that's really rewarding. Something wonderful to growing your own plants, to seeing them grow and flourish. And so today I'd just like to try and give you a general overview of the different aspects of propagation. Like I said, it is a vast field, so we'll only be able to touch upon things. We won't be able to go into too much depth. But at least you should have a better understanding of what's out there, and that way you can read up on it further. So let's get started. So vegetative propagation is also known as asexual propagation. And for some people that's a little easier to grasp, asexual being the opposite of sexual. So sexual reproduction always involves two parents. It's the mixing of two gene pools. Asexual reproduction is the opposite. We just have the one parent. So with asexual reproduction, what we're getting is clones. Now this can be a good or a bad thing, depending on what it is you're trying to gain. If we have clones, what we're basically achieving is uniformity. So if I'm growing things as a horticulturalist, uniformity is what I want to achieve. Now if I was trying to grow plants maybe to restore a native area, I would want genetic diversity, I wouldn't want clones. But for the sake of horticulture today, we're thinking we want uniformity. Now, nature naturally creates vegetative propagation, all without our own help. If we think of tubers, rhizomes, bulbs, corms, grafting, all these different methods, nature's already doing this. Sometimes it's doing it intentionally by producing tubers and corms. Sometimes it's accidentally. Maybe two branches crossed each other and they produced a graft. Now what we're doing with vegetative propagation is basically we're trying to mimic nature. We're trying to copy what nature's doing. So we do our own versions. We propagate things through tubers and bulbs and grafting and layering and cuttings. Now why would we want to do this? Why go through all the trouble to grow things vegetatively when you can grow things by seed? Well, like we said, we have that uniformity. If I'm growing things, if I was growing a red tulip, for example, and I had a bright red, medium-sized tulip, and I wanted to get bright red tulips of that medium size consistently, if I was harvesting seed, I would get diversity. I might have, out of 5 seeds, I might have 3 medium height red tulips, I might have 1 tall one, I might have a white one. Now if I want to make absolutely certain that I have only 5 red ones of the same height, I need to make sure that I'm producing genetic clones. Genetic clones meaning that I'm doing this vegetatively. The other reason for doing vegetative propagation is that we can simply produce so many plants in a short frame of time. Vegetative propagation allows us to produce plants really rapidly. Again, if we were thinking of tulips, for example, technically I could harvest tulips from a seed and grow them from a seed, but nobody does this. Why? Well, not only can we not achieve that uniformity that we want, but at the same time it's going to take that much longer. You're going to have to wait for that plant to flower. You're going to have to wait for that plant to be pollinated, to set seed, for that seed to be harvested. Then you're going to have to germinate that seed and start a whole new crop. Now, if I can start things with division, for example, with bulbs, I've skipped that whole step and I'm that much quicker. Same way if I'm growing things from cutting, it's that much faster than growing things from a seed. And this is something we've done for the longest time. Fruits are one of the best examples. If you go out and buy a fruit tree, you know that when you plant that tree, you will get that consistent fruit variety that you just purchased. Another reason for using vegetative propagation would be sometimes seeds can be very difficult to germinate. So it would be another way to get around that. So if you did decide to carry out vegetative propagation or asexual propagation, you might want to think to yourself, when is the best time to do this? Now, sometimes you might have no say in the matter. For example, you might have to pick when your plant material is available. If I want to grow things from herbaceous perennials, I wouldn't be able to do this in the wintertime when they're dormant because there's no plant material available. On the other hand, if I wanted to propagate hardwood cuttings, I wouldn't be able to do this in the summertime because I only do this when they're dormant. So sometimes it's going to be dictated by whether the plant material is even available. Other times it might be dictated by you simply happen to have material that someone's given you. Maybe a neighbor gave you a cutting. Maybe something jumped into your pocket at a botanic garden whilst you were going for a walk. Anything at all. Another factor would be, when do you want the plant for? Maybe I was growing something for a local plant sale and I had a certain date when I wanted my plants to be ready. Maybe I was growing a plant for Mother's Day. Whatever the date is, you would take that date and then you would count back from that date, knowing how long your production would take from, regardless which method you chose, say you chose a cutting, from first taking that cutting until having that finished plant. And then the other reason is simply by working with the elements. The best time to take cuttings is when we have high light levels and warm temperatures. So even though technically I might have that herbaceous perennial outside right now and the materials available, this wouldn't be the most optimal time to do it. Optimal time would be spring, summer, when light levels are high and temperatures are warm. So there's a variety of different propagation methods, and we're going to be having a look at the most general groups today, including cuttings, grafting, budding, which is another grafting method, division, layering, and micropropagation, or tissue culture. Now within each of these groups, there's still subcategories. There's endless different types of grafts, there's a few different budding methods, there's endless types of cuttings and layering. Now we're going to start with cuttings just because cuttings is the most widely practiced propagation method. It's very economically important, and for you as the homeowner, it's something really nice that you can practice at home. It's very simple, it's quite easy to do depending on what plant species you have. And there's always ample material to harvest in your garden. Now there are several divisions of cuttings. We have stem cuttings, leaf cuttings, and root cuttings. Now the picture you see in front of you here, this cutting that this lady's holding, is a stem cutting. So a stem cutting has a section of stem, and it can either have leaves on it or no leaves. When it has leaves on it, generally it's when we're harvesting material that is actively growing. And when we have stem cuttings without leaves, it's when we're taking dormant cuttings. Now a leaf cutting, on the other hand, would be simply that leaf without the stem attached to it. And your root cutting, as the word implies, would be a section of root. Now regardless of whether you're taking a stem, leaf, or root cutting, the principle is always the same. What we're doing is we're harvesting a small section of a plant, and we're trying to manipulate that segment of plant that we have into growing an entirely new plant again. And that's something that is miraculous about plants. Not many organisms have that capability of being able to reproduce an entire organism, even from individual cells. If I went and cut my finger off today and dipped it in rooting powder and tried to grow it, as we know, it would not grow. But on the other hand, I can take the smallest fragment of a plant and give it what it needs, and it has the capability to regrow. So every cell in that plant has the ability to become a root, a stem, a shoot, a flower, a leaf. So that's something that's quite unique, and it's something we can take advantage of. Now this slide that you're seeing up here right now, I just really added this in because, as I mentioned, there's a variety of different cuttings. Now if you read up on this a little more, if you get interested in propagation, you're going to come across endless different terms. So I want you to see all these terms just so that when you do start reading up, I don't want it to throw you. Really, it isn't very important which term is given to it. You're always going to have your main categories, your soft, your herbaceous growth, your more woody growth, your very woody growth, your succulents. Just knowing these basic principles is all you need to know. Once you get into all these different little distinctions between softwood and greenwood, it's not important. So when you see these things, don't let it worry you. So here we can see the three cutting types we were just speaking about. On your left, diagram 1 is 3 stem cuttings, and these happen to be 3 hardwood cuttings, but it could be any stem cuttings at all. The far left one is a straight cutting, the middle one is a heel cutting, and the heel cutting, rather than being cut off at the base, it's actually torn a little segment of that bark off with it. And the right one is a mallet cutting. So the mallet cutting actually has a little segment of stem attached to it still. So as you can see, like I said, within each category there's still more subcategories. On the right, diagram 2 is our leaf cutting. Now your leaf cutting can either be with or without petiole. And the petiole, if you remember from botany, is that little stem that's attaching the leaf to the plant stem itself. And then on the bottom, diagram 3, we see our root cuttings. Now root cuttings can be anything from a giant segment of stem to the smallest fragment of stem. Now I'd like to start with the stem cuttings just because the same way I said cuttings are the most practiced form of propagation, well, stem cuttings are the most practiced form of cuttings. So stem cuttings are very simple to do, especially if you have a plant that roots readily. The principles are always we need to have a node on the bottom and on the top. We have one node at the base of that cutting because that node's going to produce our roots. And we have to at least have one node at the top of that cutting because that's going to produce our leaves or our shoots. Now when you go out and you harvest cuttings in your own garden, the most important thing you want to look for is to make sure that plant is healthy. You don't want to have a plant that's infected. You don't want to have a plant that has pests on it. You don't want to have a plant that's stressed even. So if I go out and my plant, I realize the day I want to take my cuttings, I forgot to water it the last few days, it looks stressed, that's not a good day to take my cuttings. Make sure that plant is well hydrated and in its best health. Now the next thing you're going to look for is to get your best material. And your best material is basically the most desirable part of the plant for a cutting. Now if I want to take just a few cuttings, I can easily pick and choose. And my best part of the cutting is always going to be the tip, so it's the end of the branch. The tip, if we remember, has got that dominant growing point in it, that meristematic point. And so that's going to be our easiest cutting to root. The one cuttings that usually we'll try and avoid is going to be any cuttings that have flower buds on it. Anything with blooms or buds. Now as I was saying, you want to pick your best material if you can. Now if you had limited material or maybe you wanted to take a lot of cuttings, that's when you don't become as picky. So if say something was covered in flowers, what you would do is you would simply remove those flowers or remove those buds. Same thing, if you'd already used up all your tips, you would start working your way further down that stem. Keeping in mind that the further down the stem I go, the less likely that cutting is to root based on which plant I'm using. As a general rule of thumb, the woodier you're cutting, the harder it is to root. I would say your most ideal cutting would always have a minimum of 2 to 3 nodes on it. Now here's a few examples of stem cuttings. So these are all things that you're widely familiar with. Mums, geraniums. And geraniums is something people will try and root at home, and sometimes they'll have trouble with it. And every plant species is uniquely different and what will coax it into rooting and what it requires. Some, as we know, if I took a coleus and I stuck it in a vase, it would readily root without even having to be put into soil or in a humid environment. Geraniums, on the other hand, 9 times out of 10, when people cannot get them to root, often it's because your upright, your zonal geraniums like bottom heat. So if you can provide them with bottom heat, they'll root that much easier. Other cuttings will easily rot. geraniums, for example. So if I keep them too wet, they'll rot easily. So when you start to practice propagation at home, yes, I can read up on these different species and see what works well, but it's also going to be trial and error. So I'll try something and I'll realize it won't work, and I'll try and figure out why and change it. Same way the first time I try a recipe and it doesn't work exactly as that cookbook said, because your oven's a little different, your flour's a little different, everything's that much different. It's the same way when I'm doing propagation. So practice makes perfect. Next we have our leaf cuttings. Like we said, we can either have an entire leaf with a petiole, or we can have an entire leaf without that petiole. Now the other thing we can actually just have sections of a leaf. We don't have to have the entire leaf. Again, this is based entirely on which plant species that I'm propagating. Some plants you would require the entire leaf. Other plants, like on the left of our screen, we see a begonia here. You can use leaf sections. And if we have a look on our next slide, if you see on the bottom in the middle, we have a begonia, a black and white diagram of a begonia cutting. This is one of those cuttings where I can take either leaf segments, or the other thing I can do with this is I can take that entire leaf and lay it flat down on the soil, making sure I have a moist soil and making sure that leaf's in close contact with that soil. And then I can wound that leaf. So I can make little cuts into that leaf. So if you look on that leaf on your screen, you can see those little lines. That's where they wounded the leaf. Wherever I have one of those little cuts, that's the potential for that to root right there. So basically by getting all these different rootings on that one leaf, I can then detach all these segments and have that many new plants. Now this isn't something you can do with every plant. Every plant's different. On the top right, we see our sansevieria, our mother-in-law's tongue. This is another plant where I can have a leaf section. We can see the hand there is holding a section of that sansevieria. So you would go ahead, dip that in rooting hormone, and then stick it in the soil. Now, especially when you're doing sections of something like that sansevieria, which are all going to look pretty much identical apart from the tip, it's really a good practice to make sure that you have two different cuts on it. So if you can have a straight cut on one side and a slanted cut on the other, it's just going to ensure that you remember what was the top and what was the bottom, so you don't get it turned upside down. Personally, I like to have the slanted cut on the top, so that if you do have your cuttings in a humid environment, that water can run off, and it's not going to sit on there, making your leaf cutting more prone to disease infection. On the left, we see those African violet cuttings, and that's one of those cuttings where you just pop the entire leaf in with the petiole. And African violets are a wonderful way to go for those of you that haven't propagated before. They're one of those plants that root really easily. All you have to do is snap that leaf off, dip it in a little rooting powder, and pop it in there. Now, some plants are going to require high humidity so that they don't wilt. Other plants, especially the more succulent ones, don't require that. And especially something like an African violet, it wouldn't even want that humidity. It would start to rot. It needs that dry air circulation around it. And one of the things the mistake they'll often make, simply because they're trying to take care of that cutting, they overwater those cuttings. So remember, that cutting doesn't have any roots currently. It can't take up any water out of the soil. So if I keep repeatedly watering that soil, what I'm doing is I'm adding water which isn't being used up by that leaf cutting. So I'm really upping my chances of getting leaf rot. So try and resist the urge, especially if that cutting's been sitting there for a long time and the soil looks a little dry and you're a little concerned about it. Be patient. If I see that that cutting is starting to wilt, depending on what type it is, generally it's going to be from the air humidity rather than the soil moisture content. Now, when we go out to harvest our material, either, like we said, we could go out into our garden and simply harvest from our own garden. Personally, I like to do this first thing in the morning when it's nice and damp out. Maybe you have a little dew if you're lucky. Your plants are going to be in their best form. They won't be stressed. The temperatures will still be low. Go out there very early. Make sure you have a nice bag, maybe with a little moisture in it, so I can harvest all that material, put it in the bag. And it's really good practice to make sure you have everything set up ahead of time. In other words, you want to have those plug flats ready filled with soil, freshly watered. You want to have your cutting tools ready to go, sterilized. You want to have your rooting powder ready. Everything you're going to need should be lying there ready to go. Again, like we said, make sure what you're collecting is healthy. And then the other way you could do it is, rather than going out and collecting from things in your garden or getting pieces of material from a friend perhaps, is actually to keep stock plants specifically for that purpose. So a stock plant would simply be a plant that I'm keeping just for the purpose of cuttings. So if I had a stock plant, what I would want to do is I'd want to keep pruning it regularly to keep it in that nice vegetative state. I don't want it to get woody and I don't want it to bloom. By keeping it nice and bushy and vegetative, I'm ensuring I'm going to get the ample amount of cuttings off that plant. Keeping in mind that whenever we do take cuttings, it's really critical to try and be as quick as possible. So the more I can minimize that time period from first cutting that material off that plant to getting it into that moist soil and covering it so that it has humidity, the more successful it'll be. So our next cutting are root cuttings, and root cuttings aren't nearly as often practiced as the other forms as our leaf or stem cuttings. They don't have that high potential for wilting though, so that's a real plus point with root cuttings. You don't have to rush the same way you do, as long as you make sure you're not doing it in the heat of the day or in the direct sun. So if I was doing a root cutting, one of the things I'd really want to be careful of, make sure your tools are sterile, your knife, your pruners, whatever you're using. Especially if I'm digging up one of my plants out of my garden, removing root cuttings and putting it back in. I really want to make sure I'm not exposing that plant of mine to any form of fungal diseases. Keeping in mind it's going to have fresh cuts on there, so it will have entry points. So make sure you have sharp, clean cuts. Make sure you do everything rapidly so that plant isn't stressed. Do it early in the morning. And root cuttings are something that people sometimes order, especially online if they're buying in perennials, herbaceous perennials, shrubs. Baptisia is a classic example. So let's have a look at the different types of stem cuttings that we have. Like we said, stem cuttings are your most prolific cutting. Now, herbaceous cuttings are the most commonly taken ones for various reasons. A, they have a very high potential to root. B, they grow really rapidly, so once they're rooted in, they'll grow very fast. And C, there's usually ample material, so herbaceous plants will put on a lot of leafy growth. There's going to be a lot of cutting material. Now, your downside to herbaceous cuttings is they do wilt very, very easily. As opposed to my African violet, or as opposed to that more succulent cutting, as opposed to my dormant hardwoods or my root cuttings, that herbaceous cutting generally has a more soft leaf. It usually doesn't have that hard, waxy cuticle on it. It's not very succulent, and it's very prone to wilting. So herbaceous cuttings are always cuttings that we need to make sure they have humidity surrounding them. Now we're going to have a look at that later on, how we're best going to achieve that. Our next cutting is a softwood cutting, and softwood cuttings are also sometimes referred to as greenwood cuttings. Here in the background we see a picture of a hydrangea. Now softwood cuttings is cuttings that are taken from a woody plant. For example, your flowering shrubs, deciduous shrubs would be a classic example, and they take it early in the year. So that first bout of growth that you have, early spring, late spring, early summer, that's the material you're using for that softwood cutting. Now, if I were to take material from that same plant later in the year, late summer, early fall, it wouldn't be a softwood cutting anymore. It would now be a semi-hardwood cutting. So it could be the same plant, but taken later on. Now, if I picked a cutting and I wasn't sure, is it softwood, is it semi-hardwood, simply take that cutting between your two fingers, try and bend it back and forth a little bit and see how agile it is. If it bends easily and freely, it's likely to be softwood. Once it's starting to get more woody, it's not quite as flexible, it's getting that brown color to it, it's now a semi-hardwood cutting. Softwood cuttings do root rapidly, but not nearly as fast as herbaceous cuttings, and the percentage isn't as high. Good thing with softwood cuttings is they don't wilt quite as easily as herbaceous cuttings do, depending on which plant species I use. Now sometimes when I'm taking herbaceous shrubs, for example, deciduous shrubs for softwood cuttings, they might have larger leaves, and you can see on this picture here how they've cut those leaves in half. So that's always a good practice. If I have something that only has large leaves on it, and maybe I only have 2 large leaves, and I can't reduce any more leaves on that, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go ahead and cut them. It doesn't damage the plant at all. It doesn't matter whether it's unsightly or not, it's going to grow out of that. If I have small leaves on it and multiple leaves, it's going to be easy. I can just remove however many leaves I want. Keeping in mind the same way we always balance, if we go out and prune in our garden, we balance the roots to shoots ratio, so we don't want to have too many leaves to too many roots. Here we have no roots at all, so we really want to minimize that leaves, that foliage. We need a little foliage to make sure the cuttings can still photosynthesize, but we don't want to have too much. The more foliage I have, the more prone that cutting is to wilting. Our next one is the semi-hardwood, and again, like I said, that's simply taken later in the year. And depending on what you want to take cuttings from, basically what you would do is you would look in a propagation book or maybe online or call your extension office, and for each particular species you would find out what works best for that species. So the nice thing is that you don't have to figure it all out yourself. It's all been tried and tested. Others have done it before you. Most of it's been documented. So you could go ahead and look up, if I was going to grow a camellia, what's the best time of year to take a cutting, and what's the best cutting type? What's the most successful cutting? Now semi-hardwood cuttings, as we can see written up here, actually do better with a heel. And if you remember from that picture earlier on, instead of making that straight cut on the bottom, I've actually torn a little bark off with my cutting at the same time. Hardwoods, our last stem cutting that we have. And as I said earlier, the more I go from herbaceous to woody, the slower that cutting is going to root, and the less likely my chances are that that cutting is going to root. It's going to be that much more difficult. So hardwood cutting is the only cutting out of all the cuttings we've just looked at that I'm actually going to take when that plant is dormant. All other cuttings I'm going to take when the plant is actively growing. Hardwood cuttings you'll take either in late autumn or anywhere through to midwinter. Now when you take those hardwood cuttings, they could be anywhere from 6 to 12 inches long depending on what you're doing. Same principle as with all your other cuttings. You're going to make that cut right beneath your nodes and have several nodes on it. Now the good thing with hardwood cuttings is, as you can see on the picture, I can group them really closely together, so they're not going to take up much space. So even though they're going to take a long time to root as compared to my herbaceous, and they're going to be sitting there for a long time, I can cluster them fairly closely until they've rooted, and then I need to space them out. The other advantage is, as you can imagine, is they're not prone to wilting because they don't have any foliage on them. So they have that advantage. But if I think to myself I can root a herbaceous cutting in several weeks, your best bet, if I had the ideal conditions in a greenhouse, would be a week for some species. Hardwood cutting is going to take quite a few months. So a big difference there. Hardwood cutting, same as semi-hardwood, you want to make sure you have that heel on there. So here we can see some hardwood cuttings. And same way as I said with your Sansevieria earlier on, if I just have segments or branches and I can't tell anymore what's the top and the bottom, it's a good practice to have those 2 different cuts on there so that I'll be able to tell once I get to sticking those cuttings. Now with the hardwood cuttings, I don't have that time pressure. I don't have to stick that cutting as fast as I do with herbaceous cuttings. I could even bring these home with me and go and sit them in the refrigerator. I don't have to do them that day. Our last cutting here is succulent cuttings. And succulents are also vastly different from all our other cuttings, and that with all the other cuttings we're trying to stick our cuttings rapidly to stop them from wilting, get them in that new climate, let them start to root and acclimatize. Succulents are the exact opposite. So if I went and took a succulent cutting and I popped it straight into the soil, chances are it would rot. Your succulent cutting actually needs to be able to heal over. It needs to be able to form that callus material. So if you see that fresh cut, you need to wait until it dries out and it gets that nice white tissue over it. And that could take anywhere from weeks to months depending on what cactus species you have and the size of it. Here we can see a few cacti. On the top right we have a succulent, and all we've done here is removed a succulent leaf and sat it in the soil to put it in that close contact and wounded it, and it's starting to grow. Again, one of the things you want to make sure with your succulents and your cacti is don't overwater them. Same like I said with that African violent leaf, sometimes you're really doing best for your plants by not doing anything. Many people kill these guys through kindness. Try and keep them as dry as possible. They don't need that moisture at that time. On the left we see the moon cactus. As we know, that top section can't photosynthesize on its own, doesn't have any chlorophyll in it, hence the reason we can see the other colors. So they've gone and grafted it onto a second cactus which will photosynthesize for it. And grafting is one of our propagation methods. So let's have a look at the actual process of taking this cutting now that we've looked at the different cutting types. So with all of these cuttings, whether it's your herbaceous, softwood, hardwood, we always want to make sure that we making that first cut right beneath a node. And the node, if you remember from your botany class, is where the leaves are emerging. And the reason we want to do that is because that's where we have all our cells in there. You have a real concentration of cells in that node, and those cells are actively dividing. So those are the cells that are going to become your roots. And people will ask, how close should they make that cut? There's no exact rule. Basically, it's going to be different for each plant, and it's something you'll get better at it the more you do it. You don't want to be too close to that point, simply because if I cut into the node, I'm damaging it. And I don't want to be too far down, because the further down I go, if I'm too far away, that section of stem is going to die back to the node, and then I have some dead stems sitting there, which again will be cause for infection. Now, as we said, you need to have at least another node for shoots, preferably a few more. And this is going to depend entirely on the species. If I have a species that doesn't have any leaves or doesn't have any nodes for another 6 inches, chances are I might just have those 2 nodes. Now, if I have a plant that's got leaves coming out of it all the time, all the way up the stem, I can choose exactly where I want to position that cut. So it's going to be different depending on what you're propagating. As we said, some will root very easily without you having to do much at all, and others you'll really have to follow the guidelines closely and work hard at it. The key to most successful cuttings is going to be moisture content. Whether it's maintaining that moisture in the form of humidity, or whether it's making sure they don't get too much of it, as we were talking about the cactus, and keeping it more on the dry side. But as we said, once we take that cutting and we've removed it from the plant, it doesn't have roots, and it's going to start to wilt. Especially your herbaceous cutting, which is what we frequently take. From the second I take that cutting, it's starting to wilt. And I can reduce that and slow that down by trying to keep it hydrated, by trying to keep it in the shade, by trying to keep it cool, but it is wilting. So as we said, we want to get it in that soil as quick as possible, but I really also need to create that humid environment for this cutting. That's something that's sometimes easier said than done, depending on what I'm doing. If I am having short cuttings, it'll be a lot easier. Once you start to get larger material, things out of your garden, those semi-hardwoods, it could be a little more difficult. Again, try and make sure you always do this at a nice cool time. So here we can see your ideal conditions. This is in a propagation unit in a greenhouse. We can see the mist is currently running on this system. Typically in the summertime, they would probably have this releasing mist perhaps every 30 seconds. In the wintertime, every couple minutes, depending on what they're growing and the temperatures they have in there. In the winter, usually they'll have mist. In the summertime, often they'll have fog. Now, this is a luxury we don't have in our homes. But we don't have to. We can mimic this. We can create our own miniature greenhouse. So if I just have a few cuttings, a few individuals, something that's very easy to do, just take a solid plastic bag, a Ziploc bag, anything like that, pop it over there. Maybe put a little stick or something in the middle of that pot to hold that bag up, and then put a rubber band at the base, just to make sure you don't have air coming in and out of there. If I have more cuttings and I'm putting them into a plug flat or seed flat, go ahead and put one of those clear plastic domes over the top. This is going to be your little propagation unit. Simply by having that dome on there and making sure you lift that dome off and mist it regularly, have a little spray bottle close by, you're going to maintain that humidity. I can't stress enough the importance of having that dome. If you don't have that dome, you cannot physically mist often enough with many different species. Now these are going to be our ideal environment conditions. Now some of these we'll be able to control, some we won't. This is our ideal scenario. So in our ideal scenario, we would be able to control our light levels, our humidity content, our temperatures, both air and soil temperatures, and our air circulation. Now some of these we can control. Like we said, we can put that dome on there, make sure we get that humidity. Others, like our air circulation, are going to be more difficult. Once I've set a dome in there, I can't have both. I can't have air circulation and humidity. So some we just can't achieve, but others we can achieve. So let's look at temperature. Temperature is a critical one, not only to get things to root, but to get things to root rapidly. Like we said with that geranium earlier on, if you want to get that geranium to root rapidly and successfully, you want bottom heat. If there's two things you should invest in, I would recommend get a clear plastic dome, a piece of plastic to go over the top, and get a heating mat. Now you don't need it, but if you're going to be doing more cuttings and you're doing it regularly, it really is a good thing to have. Simply by having that bottom heat, it's really going to help you get those cuttings to root rapidly and root well. Now sometimes you could go ahead and buy it on its own, simply get the mat and then put your own flat on top. Sometimes you go and purchase the whole little unit. It'll already have the little dome, might even have a light in it depending on what you want. Now keep in mind that there's a difference between your soil temperature and your air temperature. Your soil temperature should always be a little warmer than the air temperature, and by nature it's going to be cool. And it's going to be cool because it's damp. We need to keep that soil damp so that our cutting doesn't wilt, so that's automatically going to make our soil cooler. So by having that heating pad underneath, we're going to raise that temperature. Next is light. And light, I would say, isn't quite as important as heat initially, simply because at the moment they're not utilizing that much light. So if I had something on a windowsill somewhere south facing and I had a nice bright light, that would be sufficient. Now if I wanted to do this in a basement, if I didn't have any space upstairs in the house, yes, you would want to make sure that you supply supplemental lighting. But if it's upstairs, and providing I'm doing it at the right time of year when light levels are high, if I have it on a nice bright south facing window, this will be sufficient light. Careful though that if I do have it on that south facing window and it's in the middle of summer, we don't want it to get too hot. So we do want bright light, but we don't want direct sunlight, and we don't want it to heat up too much because it will heat up like a little sauna in those domes and they will get stressed. Now this slide is a little complicated, and don't let it throw you with the auxins. I only put this in here to make you aware. When I go out and buy a rooting hormone to root that cutting, sometimes you'll have a variety of different rooting hormones available in your garden center, sometimes just the one. Usually if they have just the one, it's going to be your general rooting hormone, that's fine. If they have several different ones, it's always the same ingredient, it's just at different concentrations, depending on if I have something that's easy to root or hard to root. An auxin is basically a hormone, and plants produce these hormones naturally. We produce them synthetically and try and copy what the plant is doing. So when you buy that rooting powder, it's that synthetic version of that plant hormone. Now when you go out and buy something, chances are it's going to be what you see at the bottom, that IBA. And here we can see that rooting powder. 9 times out of 10 when people buy rooting powder, it comes in a powder form. What they've done is they've mixed it with talc powder. This is great for homebodies because you don't have to worry about overdosing. You don't have to worry about having too high a concentration and damaging that cutting. That can't happen when it's mixed down with talc powder. So what you're going to do is you're going to dip that cutting into that powder at the base, and then you're going to tap it off lightly. You want to tap it just to get the excess off there. You don't want too much. Now, other versions that you could buy would be a liquid rooting powder. That's commonly used with our hardwood cuttings. We can take a whole bunch, dip them in, let them sit in there, and then pull them out. Personally, I would recommend using your rooting powder. Now, when you do go and tip something into this, it's a good practice just to tip it in a little something, and just a little bit, however much you think you'll use. We usually end up using far less than we think. And then that way you can go and tip that away when you've finished. You don't want to put it back into that bottle and contaminate it for the next time. When you're taking your cutting, essential, always have sharp tools, regardless of what you're using. If you're using a knife, if you're using pruners, they should be sharp. When I'm removing those bottom leaves, like we said, we don't want to have too much foliage. Some leaves you might be able to just pinch off, other ones might tear, and you might tear a little bit of that bark. We don't want to do that. We don't want to have any entry point for disease. So then you would go ahead and just cut them off instead. You do want to make sure you have those bottom leaves off, A, so that it's not so prone to wilting, and B, so that you're not burying any leaves in the soil. Make sure any of your tools are not just sharp but also sterile. So you can get rubbing alcohol, go ahead and wipe them down, take some high spirit out of your liquor cabinet, anything at all will do. And sometimes, depending on what you're using, if you're using rooting powder, it might already have a fungicide mixed in with it. Now you don't have to be fanatical about having your workspace super sterile. Just clean it down, sweep it off. That'll do just fine. Now when we put this cutting into the soil, we call this sticking. And it's good practice just to have a bamboo stick or a pencil or something, pre-poke those holes, so that when I put that cutting in there, I'm not forcing it in there and I can't damage it. Now, the soil you want to use, basically it should be a nice light soil. At the same time, it should retain moisture. I think every potting soil works fairly well, as long as you're using something that is not too coarse, so you don't have too much bark or anything in it, and preferably anything that isn't very, very fine, like something for starting seeds. Just have your regular potting mix. It's going to be full of perlite, it's going to be nice and loose, and it's going to stay nice and damp. Don't use soil out of your garden because it's far too heavy a soil to use in pots for cuttings, and also it's not sterile. Again, like I said, try to practice caution and don't overwater. Those cuttings need minimal water. It's a good practice to water your seed flats or your pots or whatever you're using before sticking that cutting. If I've watered it before and then I stick the cutting and I put that dome on, chances are I won't hardly need to water at all after that. All I should be doing to a large extent is misting. Now sometimes it's hard to decide when your cutting is ready. When should I take that dome off? When should I leave it on? Now if you take your dome off and you see your plants are instantly wilting, chances are they're not quite ready yet. But even if they were ready, we don't want to just yank that dome off. So a good thing to do when you think they're ready, start slowly opening that dome. Maybe crack it open for a day, let a little air in there. The next day have it half off, and so on and so forth. If I had a bag over it, I would poke some holes into that bag. So you don't want these plants to go from that high humidity environment to no humidity at all, because you will shock and stress them, even if they are rooted in. On the other hand, you don't want to leave them in there too long, because by having that dome over the top, even though it is clear, they're not getting as much light as they should, and they will start to stretch. So how do you know if that cutting's exactly ready to come out? Just take 2 fingers and ever so gently give it a little tug. If you feel any resistance, that means that you've got root growth. If you don't feel any resistance, try not to tug it too much. Leave it be. You don't want to disturb it. Leave it in there a little longer. Now the next thing I have in here, I have a slide on pinching. And just because this is often something people forget to do when they've grown plants from cuttings, then they end up having a plant that doesn't have the habit or the shape that they would like. So it's real good practice when you've grown something from a cutting, and once it's put on several sets of leaves, after a few weeks, go ahead and pinch that cutting. So take the tip out of the cutting, and this is going to force that cutting to branch out. So on the top here we can see they're pinching out a fuchsia cutting. We've got these side branches coming out. On the bottom left we see a poinsettia cutting that's rooted. Those large dark green leaves are the original leaves. Those light green leaves, the small ones, are what's come from us having pinched that cutting, and it's forcing those side branches to leaf out. On the right you can see how nice a bushy a plant we have after that. And depending on what plant you're growing, mums for example, and which variety I have, I might want to pinch those twice. So that's our little summary on cuttings. We're going to touch upon grafting briefly. And grafting's a little different to cuttings, as in cuttings we're literally just trying to reproduce plants rapidly and make sure we have genetic clones. Cuttings, with grafting it's a little different. We have another agenda. With grafting we're trying to combine advantageous characteristics of two plants without losing either of them. So if we think of our fruit trees, for example, when you buy a fruit tree, it has that characteristic graft at the base you can see on the stem. And most of the time they're doing this because we want to make sure we're keeping the fruit that we want. Say we have a red delicious apple, we make sure we always have that red delicious apple. At the same time we might want to have something from that rootstock. So perhaps it's disease resistance, perhaps it's cold tolerance, maybe it's vigor, maybe it's a dwarfing characteristic, whatever it is. And then we're going to combine those two characteristics without losing either one. And there's a whole variety of different grafts, and grafting tends to be a topic that people sort of steer away from a little bit. It can be a little daunting. But I want to show you with these slides that grafting can be anywhere from the simplest graft to the most complicated. So as long as you try and practice the simple graft, with time you should be able to master it just fine. Now in the picture you see in front of you, on the left we have what is called a cleft graft. And this is something you would use if you already had a mature established tree in your garden. Say you had an apple tree and you decided you wanted a different variety on that apple tree, and you cut it down, and now you have that wide stump. So what they've done is they've simply taken a wedge out of that stump and they've put two little branchlets of our new variety in there. They've put two, you don't have to put two, one would suffice as well. And they will fill in, even though initially it's going to look a little odd with that size difference. You might even have better success with one branch in the long run, because with two they tend to break out once it becomes a mature tree. Now something like this graft is not what I would recommend trying if you're new to grafting. This is something you would work your way up to. In the middle we can see a whip and tongue graft, also a really complicated graft. That would be one of the last grafts I would attempt. And on the right we have a saddle graft. Now let's have a look at a slightly simpler graft. So here we have a side graft. This is much easier to do. Basically what we're doing is we're making a cut into our rootstock. And I should mention, when we're grafting, we always have two plants. The plants that's going to form the base of our new plant we refer to as the rootstock. The plant that's going to be on the top of that new plant we refer to as the scion. So in this diagram we can see we're making a cut into that larger diameter stem, that's our rootstock, and that smaller twig you see, that's our scion. We're going to slip it into there. So basically I'm cutting open a slit, and then I'm going to slide that new branch in there so it sits in that pocket nice and snug. Now the most important thing with any graft, regardless of which type or which plant, you always have to ensure that the cambium layers on both plants match up. Now, cambium is, if I remove that outer layer of bark, the cambium is what's directly beneath it, and it's what your plant uses to transport water and nutrients up and down, from the shoots up and down to the roots. So we don't want to damage that at all, and at the same time we really need to ensure that they match up. If they don't match up, they won't be able to, that graft won't be able to fuse, and those water and nutrients won't be able to go up and down. Now once we've got our little side branch set in that pouch, we're going to cut the top off of that original rootstock, and then we're going to seal that wound. You can seal that wound with grafting tape or with grafting wax, whatever works best for you. Here we have another graft, and on the left we see our simplest graft. This is called a splice graft, also referred to as a whip graft. On the right, the 3 stems on the right are whip and tongue graft, so we have that additional cut in there. If you're new to grafting, your splice graft is the best graft for you to practice with. Now you don't necessarily have to graft anything woody like a fruit tree. These days many vegetables are grafted as well. If you go to your garden center, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, squashes, you'll always find grafted versions. Tomatoes will graft for disease resistance, soil-borne disease resistance, and for vigor. So that means I'll have a larger crop. Now, if you wanted to graft tomato plants, those are wonderful to practice with, just because seeds are very inexpensive. You can grow a whole crop, and you can practice that graft. Now, if you're going to practice that graft on tomato seedlings, you literally only want to have them maybe 3 inches tall. Tiny little seedlings, and then you're going to just make 2 diagonal cuts on both plants, put those stems together and put a little silicone clip on them. So that's a few grafting methods. There are far more, just to give you an idea. Another grafting method is budding. Budding, again, there's a variety of different budding practices. One of the traditionally most practiced versions is what they call tea budding. And if you can see on the diagram in front of you, the stem that says B on the base of it, we have a T that's cut into that trunk there. Now that's our rootstock. And then what you want to do is you want to remove a bud from your scion. So you're going to go and take a sharp grafting knife, cut below that bud. Make sure you go a little deeper so you don't damage that bud. This works wonderful on roses. Then you're going to, on that T cut on your rootstock, you're going to use that knife to flap back that bark. So you want to open up that T on the top and fold back those 2 flaps. Once you've folded back those 2 flaps and exposed the cambium, you're going to take that little bud, sit it in there, make sure those cambium layers are aligned. Then you're going to fold those flaps back and then seal it up with tape. So with all those versions, again, we're always trying to combine 2 plants. Now, another propagation method is something we usually don't think of as propagating, really, but it's something most of us already practice in our yards, and it's division. So you would probably be dividing your herbaceous perennials, are common ones to do. And sometimes you might not even be dividing them to propagate them. You might just be dividing them to keep your plants young and in a manageable size and making sure they still bloom freely. But if you're already digging them up and splitting them up, you could propagate them at the same time. Now for some things like hostas, I could just take a sharp spade and chop them into individual little chunks and then go ahead and replant them. If I had something like daylilies, I would want to try and tease them apart and not damage them. Other plants, you might have little offsets or little bulblets, and I could just remove those. Bulbs are a classic example of this. Bulbs will rapidly multiply if they're in the ideal conditions, especially if they're not being eaten by deer or anything else. So I wouldn't get my hopes up with this with tulips, but if I had daffodils, for example, or grape hyacinths, they will multiply prolifically. So I can go ahead, lift up that clump. Good time to do this is very, very early in the year. Divide them up real easily. Make sure that when I lift that clump, I don't put that spade into one of those bulbs. I don't want to create any entry point for disease. Divide them up and then go ahead and replant them. Corms are very similar to bulbs, and people often mistake them. And for the purposes of propagation, there is no difference, but they are, botanically speaking, not a true bulb. Examples of corms would be crocuses, freesias, crocosmias. They look very similar, but if you cut them open, they don't have those classic scales like an onion would, for example. Same thing though, if the bulbs are happy, they will be producing bulblets. You can come ahead and divide those. If they aren't producing those and you don't know why, maybe you should make sure that if you have a richer soil, add organic matter, add compost, and make sure you don't cut them down too soon after blooming. Rhizomes are another underground structure, and it's another thing we can divide and propagate. The image you're seeing here is a bearded iris. So iris, like with bulbs and all these plants, once the clump gets too big, often they won't bloom the way we want them to. Sometimes they'll get unsightly. So it's a good practice every few years to lift that clump up and divide it. Now if you wanted to use those sections that you've divided, you would go ahead and replant those. When you're planting rhizomes, make sure that you have them horizontal to the soil. Something like iris, you would want to have them just below the soil surface with those eyes poking out. If I had a different rhizome, like a canna, for example, a tender perennial, those would want to go deeper down into the soil. Tubers, same thing. We're going to lift those up. Now sometimes you're already going to be lifting these. If I have dahlias and I want to keep them going from year to year, as we know we need to lift them and store them indoors. They're not winter hardy. Same with the cannas. Once I'm storing those indoors, when I want to repot them early next spring, either I can go and sit that clump back in as is, or I could split those up and propagate them. Now if I'm propagating them, try and make sure each little division you have has roots on it. Try and make sure you don't damage them too much when you're dividing them. And as opposed to the rhizome, you don't want them horizontal, you want them at an angle, just below the soil surface. Our next method is layering. And many people are familiar with air layering, and that's the image we see here right now. Air layering is practiced often at home with tropicals or for house plants. And the advantage of layering is, as opposed to the cutting, we're allowing that segment of plant to form new roots whilst it's still attached to the plant. This way it doesn't suffer stress, it's not prone to wilting, and we can detach it once we already have that new root set. Now there's a variety of layering methods. Some are more practiced in the garden, like here we have simple layering or tip layering. This is a method that's used for plants that when their branches touch the soil, their tips will root. So if we think of black raspberries and blackberries and things like that, we're going to mimic that process. So you're going to take that branch, give it a sharp bend, and then fold it back up again. Now you want to make sure you have one node below the soil and one node above the soil. The one below it, which is where it'll root, and the one above for the leaf growth. Now sometimes simply that sharp bend will be enough to initiate rooting. Other times you'll have to damage that stem a little bit below the soil to encourage it further. Once it has rooted, just go ahead and detach that. The next version is compound layering or serpentine layering. Same as the simple layering, just instead of the one, we have several. Then we have mound layering or stool layering. What we're going to do in this case is for any of our woody upright plants, go ahead and cut that plant right down early in the spring before it's grown or leafed out, just to 1 or 2 inches. When it starts to grow, mound that soil up. By mounding that soil up, what you're going to do is that fresh growth is going to root at the same time. Once it's readily rooted, you can just go ahead and cut each individual stem off, and those will all be separate plants. This is something that's often used on apple rootstocks. Next we have trench layering or continuous layering. In this example, what we're doing is we're taking the entire branch, laying it flat down, horizontal, below the soil, and each node is going to root and grow upwards. So when I went and harvested that, I would cut each individual into a new plant. And then our final one here is our air layering. This is what I said is often practiced indoors, can be practiced outdoors too. If you had, for example, a Dracaena palm in your house and it had long stems with very little leaf growth on it, only some foliage at the top, very unsightly, what you could do is carry out air layering. So the process is you want to make 2 cuts around that stem. And if you see that little picture, that little inset on the bottom left, they've made 2 cuts an inch apart and they're peeling that outer layer of bark off. They're exposing that cambium. Then you're going to go ahead and put some rooting hormone around that, put some moist sphagnum moss, some potting soil, then you're going to bag it up. If I'm doing it indoors, plastic's fine. If I'm doing it outdoors, tin foil is good to keep the sun out of there so it doesn't heat up too much. Once that segment's rooted, I can go ahead and cut it off. This way I can propagate that plant without risking losing it. And then, as we said, with all methods, nature does do this itself. So if you think of strawberries, for example, with stolons or runners, everywhere it touches down, it roots. Creeping Charlie, same thing. Everywhere it touches down, it roots. Here we can see a spider plant. Those spider plants, as we know, they're already growing little plantlets with air roots, just waiting to touch the soil so they can grow. So that was layering. Our final one here is micropropagation, also known as tissue culture. Now, this is not something you're going to practice at home simply because we don't have those aseptic conditions in our homes. You need that sterile lab environment. Even if we've cleaned everything perfectly in our homes, we still have bacteria floating in the air. So this is something you can't practice unless you have completely aseptic conditions. Now, the advantage of tissue culture is I can grow plants from single cells, so I need only a fragment of plant material. So this is an excellent way to ensure that rare plants aren't plundered from the wild anymore. Orchids aren't harvested from the wild, because we can grow a huge number of plants from minimal material with this. And what they're doing is they're going to grow things in perfect conditions. Those plants are going to sit in the right light environment, the right temperature, in a nutrient solution and get exactly what they need. For those of you that have a fish tank, if you ever go and buy fish tank plants, sometimes you'll see they're sitting in that characteristic jelly in a bag. That's how they've grown them. So, that was it. I apologize for rushing through everything. Like I said, it's a really vast topic and there's so much to cover. Obviously, I could only touch upon some things. I hope it's given you sort of a general idea of different avenues of propagation, what's out there and how to tackle them. You know, the best way is simply to practice. Practice makes perfect. Nature's very forgiving. There's always more material. And like I said, start with something that will root very easily, have a success, and then go more from there. Now, if you had any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Alternatively, you see my information's up here. Like I said, I work in North Cook. So you have my number up here and my email address, and I'll be happy to answer any questions as best I can. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending and spending your evening with me. I'm not seeing any questions right now. Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure. Thank you very much, and have a very pleasant evening. Like I say, if you have any questions, get in touch with me or any other extension colleague. We'll do our best to try and answer them as best we can. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening. Thank you.